Well, the two leaders spoke briefly to journalists before going into private talks. Here's a little of what was said there.
Herkes bugün Türkiye-Rusya ilişkilerinde bu ziyaretimizde
Today, everyone is looking at the grain corridor issue in Turkey-Russia relations. They're waiting to see what will come out today regarding the grain corridor. I believe that the message we give the world in a press conference after our meeting will be very important, especially for underdeveloped African countries.
We have a lot to talk about from the point of view of ensuring security in the region. Of course, we will not ignore the issues related to the Ukrainian crisis. I know that you intend to raise questions about the grain deal. We are open to negotiations on this issue.
Well, listening to that brief address was Oliver Farry from our foreign desk, and he's with me now. Oliver, what do you think we should expect to come out of this meeting today?
Well, the hope is that the grain deal that was suspended 6 weeks ago will be kick-started once again. It was a lifeline for countries outside of the conflict, particularly developing ones, and it managed to keep grain prices low even as the war continued in Ukraine. But Russia was not happy with this. Moscow thought that it got a raw deal, that commitments made by other parties were not being met. Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Turkey have positioned themselves as brokers here. Erdogan has not always had the cosiest ties with Vladimir Putin, particularly during the early days of the Syrian civil war when they were on different sides of the divide. But things have warmed up considerably, and Turkey, even though it's a NATO member, has not completely severed its ties with Russia since the latter's invasion of Ukraine. There has been trade between the two countries continuing, including some that skirted Western sanctions on Russia, Turkey being used as a staging point for trade from third countries until Ankara put a stop to it earlier this year. Now, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres sent Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov what he called a series of concrete proposals to get the grain deal up and running. But Moscow says that they don't go far enough. Turkey is being quite understanding. It says that it's dispatched Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan for talks ahead of today's meeting. Russia wants greater commitments on matters such as financing and insurance that will allow its own grain and also fertilizer exports, which are not subject to sanctions, to continue. But will Vladimir Putin be willing to restart the deal? Because he's got his own reasons for maybe dragging his feet on it as well. His Russian forces have been targeting Ukrainian grain ports overnight with drone attacks. So the Russian president is very conscious of the leverage that he might have here.
And you mentioned there, or you touched on one of the justifications that Vladimir Putin has for pulling out of that deal. He's complained that Russia has been sort of effectively shut out of grain trade around the world since the war in Ukraine broke out. Is there any truth to what he says?
Well, it hasn't prevented Moscow from shipping record amounts of grain last year, because there have been countries that have stepped in to fill the gap, such as China and India, which have been buying quite a lot of grain. Now, that said, there is some truth to Russia's complaints. Agricultural exports such as grain and fertilizer from Russia may not be subject to sanctions, but paying for those exports is a complicated matter for third-party countries because of the sanctions on Russian banks. Now, Moscow wants the state-owned Russian Agricultural Bank to be exempted from these sanctions to ease the process of paying for these grain deals. Now, they will obviously want clarity on the message sent to third parties, many of whom are very, very nervous and spooked, so to speak, of violating sanctions, even if in this specific case it is permitted. Now, Russia has also tried to use grain as a wedge issue in shoring up support in the global south. We've seen often over the last 18 months that impressions of Russia in developing countries are very different from how they are in the West, and Moscow gets a sympathetic ear in quite a lot of foreign capitals, particularly in Africa. The spectre of rising food prices is something that makes a lot of governments nervous, and Russia knows this, and this is what Recep Tayyip Erdogan also alluded to earlier on as well. So the grain deal can be a very, very useful diplomatic tool for Moscow, but it can also cut both ways.
Oliver Farry, thank you very much indeed for that. And